Hello everyone. Welcome to our session on aid worker security and the rise of state detentions. It's great to see you all here with us today. My name is Mariah Joe, and I work with Humanitarian Outcomes. For the first part of this session, it will be recorded and posted online after. As a reminder, this is a Zoom meeting format to allow for maximum participation at the end. So please make sure your cameras are off and your microphones are muted until the end. If you have any questions throughout, please feel free to put them into the chat and we can pose them to the panelists at the end, or you can ask yourselves when we get to that section. Today's session will be 3 different presentations, followed by a Q&A with the panelists, and then we will open the discussion for everyone to participate on the topic. We will be using the last discussion to inform background for our upcoming aid worker security report, but I will discuss more about that at the end. Our first presenter, Abby Stoddard from Humanitarian Outcomes, will discuss aid worker detention data and recent trends. Next up will be Christina Willie from Insecurity Insight on the changing sentiment towards aid. And finally, Rob from Crisis 24 will provide some real-world perspectives and examples on how their groups handle the detention of individuals. I will now hand it over to Abby Stoddard.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for that intro, MJ. And I want to thank again my fellow panelists for agreeing to join us to discuss this topic today. So our team that runs the Aid Worker Security Database, or AWSD, has been looking at the issue of detentions pretty closely for a while now, not only because detentions are increasing as a category of security incident and a different sort of challenge to operational security for aid work, but also because they seem to crystallize a trend in the broader political landscape, wherein state actors are increasingly being the cause of insecurity for aid workers. So what I'm going to do is sort of set the scene for the discussion today with some data and general observations, and then my fellow panelists will get into more detail. Next slide, please. Since it was created, the Aid Worker Security Database has tracked killings, kidnappings, and serious injuries, which include sexual assault. And these were always the principal outcome categories and have been for the past 20 years. But last year, we decided to add state detentions as a distinct category after more than a year of hearing increasingly from program and security managers that detentions and arrests by local and national authorities were becoming a bigger problem. So we started tracking these incidents going forward, and the team went back and retrospectively gathered and disaggregated incidents back to the late 1990s. Increasing frequency means a more present risk and a greater operational burden for organizations trying to sustain secure access. And we heard from many practitioners that in some contexts, detentions now consume more of their efforts for security risk management than kidnappings did. So they've increasingly become a very present risk. And in some ways, detentions are similar to kidnappings in that they can sometimes be violent. They can inflict significant psychological harm to victims and their families, and operational harm to the organizations that often have to pause their activities while they focus on crisis management. But the difference is with kidnappings, humanitarian organizations over the years have built up crisis management capacities and protocols for dealing with them, while detentions now bring in a whole slew of unfamiliar legal and diplomatic elements that civil society organizations often aren't prepared for. Finally, kidnap for ransom can be a crime of opportunity, and negotiations are often transactional. But when state authorities raid offices and project sites and take away staff, this is a targeted and deliberate strategy. So states and military actors are seizing aid workers as a means sometimes for intelligence gathering, for leverage over organizations, general harassment, and control and intimidation of populations. It creates an incredible sort of chilling effect for civil society. Can you advance the slide? So on the data, and with the caveat that we're clearly going to be missing some from earlier years, but nevertheless, we're confident in what shows as a significant increase in aid worker detentions from 2020 onward. And this post 2020 surge kind of maps directly onto the surge of conflict violence and violence against aid workers generally that we've seen, with new wars erupting, others escalating, and military coups and consolidations that have occurred in the past 5 years. And I would point you specifically to the events in Myanmar in 2021, which saw a huge wave of detentions, and the Houthi consolidation in Yemen in 2024, both corresponding with high points in detention numbers. Next slide. In terms of the geographical spread, you see this is for all incidents again. You see the highest incidence is clearly Myanmar, followed by OPT, which essentially means Gaza, and Yemen after that. Afghanistan has also been kind of significant. We've seen the Taliban get back into the detention business after passing the ban on female staff and their general sort of crackdown on NGOs in the country. Before the Taliban came to power, whenever they would do these detentions, it was noted as a kidnapping because they were a non-state actor at that time, just so you know the difference in our coding. Yeah, and Yemen also stands out for these detentions where they were very systematic and intelligence-driven, where multiple staff from the same organizations were detained at once, and it was targeting leadership. So in the next slide, you can see an organizational breakdown of detainees. National aid workers and national organization staff in general are the most affected. So staff from local and NGOs over 250, INGOs more than 100 less than that, UN agencies at 58, and then you've got IFRC and the Red Cross movement generally a bit lower. So obviously, local and national NGOs bear the heaviest burden on this, as they do with many other incidents. They are the least likely to report. So again, their number that is almost certainly an undercount. And you see here, states are leaning hardest on their own civil societies with this tactic. At the same time, though, I want to point out that international staff have higher rates of detention relative to their small numbers. And that makes sense. It's the same in kidnappings. In kidnappings, internationals bring more visibility and can fetch higher ransoms. Same here, they have often higher leverage in detentions. And the next slide. So I'm just going to sum up on the sort of implications for the sector as a whole, and before we go on to get into it in more detail in the discussion. The detentions, as I said, reflect deliberate state policy often, which makes it a political and diplomatic matter, which humanitarian security risk management systems really don't have the preparation and response capacities. Most NGOs lack the political and legal tools that are needed, like lawyers on staff who can navigate post-state law, the diplomatic relationships that come into play, and the necessary and appropriate insurance cover. National and local organizations have the least institutional protection and are the most frequent targets. And just zooming out, you could say that detentions represent a frontline symptom of the general authoritarian creep and erosion of international humanitarian law that we're seeing across the world in the past 5 years. The absence right now of meaningful international pushback is essentially a green light for continued impunity by state and military actors. What the sector needs is collective advocacy, and if diplomats, if member states aren't going to push back, they need to develop new tools expressly designed for state-perpetrated incidents like these. I would say that it's the targeting of local civil society is a long-term threat to the humanitarian system and to the localization agenda, which, as we know, is already under threat with the defunding crisis. And I will just close by reemphasizing that detentions are different from kidnappings and not just a new form of an old problem. And it really requires NGOs and other humanitarian actors to develop their capabilities themselves if they are not going to be supported by the international community in this. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Abby. We'll move on now to Christina Lilly.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm Christina Vella from Insecurity Insight. And as Abby said, arrests and detentions are really a growing issue that is of great concern. And it is not just the arrest of the aid workers, it is also increasing searches of officers and suspensions of license that really highlight how the humanitarian environment is under threat. And this is also, as Abby said, this is a deliberate policy. We are not facing a situation where suddenly aid workers become more criminally minded or aid agencies becoming more corrupt. It is really something that has shifted in the environment. And I think one of the reasons we are seeing this trend is because there is something that many call criminalization of aid. That is the portraying of aid activities as somewhat being illegitimate, as being harmful. And what I'm going to concentrate now in the remarks as part of this presentation is to look at how social media has impacted that environment that has led to such a high risk of aid agencies being targeted with such legal measures from states. And the other reason we are sort of looking at this is because throughout this presentation, as you will later hear, there's lots of reflection on how aid agencies need to be prepared, what measures need to be in place that they can respond adequately when there is an arrest. So what I'm also doing with this presentation is asking the broader question, is there a way of detecting when the environment becomes risky to such conversations that aid agencies are actually harmful actors? What is it what would signal that there is such a risk? And what can be done to potentially prevent that these sort of acts are actually taken against aid agencies? And I'm doing that by looking at what does social media narratives tell us around this. So you can move to the next slide. But before diving into this, let me just give a few thoughts on the way of how to understand of how social media actually impacts the environment in which aid agencies work, how the sentiments towards the aid sector is created on social media. Many of you are probably familiar with the concept of often referred to as MDH, which is disinformation, misinformation, disinformation, and harmful narratives. So this would be incidentally deliberate false information on social media. We propose that when we think about the aid sector, we should not approach it through a concept of MDH, but rather through a lens of harmful narratives. And I will explain why we think this is so important, because it is how these narratives are created. They're not so much created through one false disinformation about aid agencies. They are created through conversations that happen on social media around aid activities that are misinterpreted, misunderstood, and reacted to in an emotional manner that becomes a negative and a harmful. So I will sort of go into some details to explain this, and you can move to the next slide. So to give some sort of concrete examples of how this process works. Here is one example of where a town was taken by a rebel force and they overrun an aid office and stole some medical equipment, and they posted, this rebel group, the image of the stolen equipment on social media. These became interpreted by social media users as seeing these images as proof that the aid agency had supplied the rebel force with equipment that the local population did not have access to. And that is an example of how the limited information of a picture trailing on social media can become a false narrative without anyone making any direct false claims. And other typical examples, and I've put some out here from Sudan, the DRC, and Syria, is that a lot of the harmful information also comes from disappointment in or the expectation gap between what people think aid can deliver and what they see arriving. So a typical example would also be then after a devastating natural disaster, aid agencies would post images of aid arriving at an airport with some celebratory message, X tons of something having been delivered. Now, people see this creates hopes, but then several weeks later, people wonder why they haven't received anything. And that is then also the moment when their sort of very negative, harmful narratives start to emerge on social media, claiming the aid must have been siphoned off, there is corruption, and that is all of these things that explain why people did not receive the aid. The truth is probably there simply wasn't enough to go around. But the issue is that on social media, these narratives take a form on their own, and they create over time with difficult situations in which people live. They create a sentiment that blames in a way the aid agencies for a lot that is not right, and to a way that they become to justify. They might see violence against aid agencies. We're seeing it very often when there's looting, that there is a sense of we're just taking what is rightfully ours. So this is the sort of the overall environment we're seeing being created on social media, and you can move to the next slide. So the questions really are, so where is this all coming from, and how does this sort of really contribute to the criminalization of aid and the fact that we're seeing a rise in arrests? So one really, really big driving factor is this expectation gap between what people think aid can bring them, and this is partly also the way we talk about it in such a universal manner, and what they feel they are actually receiving. Another area in which we're seeing a very strong expectation gap is in protection. There is regularly on social media so much hope that the international community will come to people's aid, will protect them from aggressive state forces taking over, from aerial raids on communities, on hospitals, on schools. But there often is nothing that is actually done to physically protect people. And this discrepancy between the belief in what the universal UN aid system in the ideal world would deliver and what people experience as a reality is increasingly creating a very hostile environment of unmet expectations. And then within that, we're having the difficulty that aid agencies find it very challenging to communicate the humanitarian principles in a manner that is adequate for social media. Very often, aid agencies have the tendency to express their neutrality by remaining silent or referring to, we will talk to all parties in conflict. And these are messages that are not really understood on social media. In fact, they're very often understood as support for either a state party conducting violence against civilians or endorsing rebel forces. There are, of course, also a few malicious actors who will post deliberate false information, and we have seen this in several places. But overall, in terms of quantity of what is creating a harmful environment, it is really more what is driven by community conversations. And then how do we explain the link to arrests? I think it is very often when there are governments, and quite often when there is a change in government, because there is a coup or a revolution or some sort of regime change, very often governments then feel the need to demonstrate some sort of action towards populations. And then it sometimes seems that arresting aid workers, raiding aid officers, withdrawing licenses is what is seen as a popular act that gets support from the communities because of the harmful narratives that are entrenched out there on social media. And then it becomes an act that governments choose to do as part of a broader policy approach. So you can move to the next slide. So the question is obviously, what can be done about it? And the overall need, I think, is that their aid agencies need to learn to build accurate and positive descriptions of their work that are embedded in the values they stand for. But this is incredibly difficult, and this is also something we can come to in the wider discussions, because I think most teams are not well enough equipped to monitor. They are also so challenging to communicate because aid agencies are used to having a particular way of talking to donors, to state actors, to the host governments they work in, to the communities. On social media, the one post, the one comment is simultaneously going to all of these actors. And that makes it really hard and requires really an adaptation of communication for this medium around the core values of an organization. And it doesn't work to simply copy how you would communicate to individual actors on their own. So you can move to the next slide. So what are these sort of operational tools that people or aid agencies really need? There needs to be a crisis response plan to when either narratives go viral on social media, but also when there's critical incidents. Because critical incidents, the arrest itself or a kidnapping or a looting of an office, is very often the trigger point for harmful narratives. And then within aid agencies, it is becoming increasingly clear that we need much better collaboration between the security departments, communications and programs to really find ways to communicate and to respond to these risks. You can't do these things flying blind. You need to know what the narratives are within a country. And this is why we are seeing that local organizations are actually much, much better at maneuvering this space than international agencies that sometimes come in with their own conceptions. So the monitoring for international agencies is absolutely vital to understand the conversations. Also, agencies need their own protocols of when to react, when not to react. And then finally, on the arrests, they are particularly challenging to manage on social media because you are at the same time communicating visibly to the state forces that have arrested the aid worker, but it's also a communication to donors, to your own staff, to the communities. And to get that right is very, very hard. And at the same time, when there is no communication, we very often see that someone else drives the narrative and that others become to talk about this arrest and create a narrative of how this person was perhaps a spy or other things that makes it then becomes a sort of trial on social media before the arrest gets addressed through other official means, and that can make it extremely difficult to deal with this. So that's why it's also important to have good communication plans in place for arrests. And yeah, you can move to the final slides, and I'd be very quick on this. This is just to say we are monitoring this. If you're interested, I will post some links in the chat. You can subscribe to the mailings of regular reviews, and you can move to the next slide. We also have a few learning documents of where we look at what we've learned from the social media communications in Myanmar, the Sahel, the DRC, and around some specific issues if you're interested. And then finally, really to conclude, you can move to the last slide, Mariah, is that I think we are really at a very critical point because we're seeing aid under so much attack. We all know about the reduced funding, but what we are also seeing is this very strong questioning of the values, the principles of aid on social media that is playing out on so many different levels, including at countries of intervention. And I think we need to find a way to turn this narrative around, because this is all part of this really shrinking of the aid space from all sides that we're currently seeing. And therefore, I think it does require a lot of attention. And with that, I'll stop here.
Thanks very much, Christina. Just a reminder for those that joined later, please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll pose them to the presenters during the Q&A session, or you can keep them in mind and ask them yourself. So next we will be moving on to Rob Adams.
Hi, nice to meet you all, as it were. My name is Rob Adams. I work for Crisis 24. We are an international security crisis response organization. We are a corporate that are hired largely by insurance companies to respond in the event that organizations like yours and media organizations and corporates around the world have an incident. I have done dozens of detention cases in the last few years, for many of them for NGOs, many of them in Africa. So I want to talk, after that fascinating talk by Christina just now and the introduction from Abby, I'd like to talk about some of the really detailed nitty-gritty of how we respond to these cases, what you as organizations can do to help resolve them effectively. First slide, please. There are a number of things that you can do well in advance. Maintaining your CMT and IMT training is absolutely vital. Crisis management team, incident management team. Crisis management team is usually at headquarters level. IMT, incident management team, is usually on the ground in the location. Training and practicing and rehearsing and discussing what you are going to do, who's going to be involved, how you're going to manage the HR component, the family component, communications component, and not to mention the most important bit, which is the actual, shall we call it, a negotiation with the authorities to secure a quick release, is absolutely essential. Maintaining the contacts with authorities and organizations like UNOCA and INSO is also absolutely essential. I'll talk in a bit about how the speed of your response and the level of authority that you can contact pretty much in every case determines how long these cases last. You need to train your staff both to respond if one of their colleagues are detained, arrested, but also what happens in what they should expect in their own situation. We've done cases recently in DRC, in Eastern DRC, where people have been caught, been arrested, detained on the street by the new government, as it were, the M23, or their allies, and had their phones checked. And of course, their phones have been full of contacts to government authorities who were the authorities some days, weeks before. It's very hard to know whether to recommend to people that you clean your phones every time there's a change of regime, but it's certainly something that you should be thinking about. Every time a new authority turns up in an area, it's worth thinking about who you were talking to before they got there. It's worth thinking within this CMT, IMT training and staff awareness, it's worth thinking about who you're going to contact in the event of an incident like this. Obviously, from my position, one of your earliest contacts should be through to your chief financial officer or your administration officer, HR team, who should in turn contact the insurance broker, who can get our company or one of the other companies that do this involved as quickly as possible. There is no doubt that a swift, serious response to this is very effective. We see cases where organizations come to us a week or 10 days after an incident. It's always going to take longer to secure a release. And you need to anticipate problems. Christina outlined it very effectively earlier. There is a historical I've used the word naivety on the slide. That's not fair. There's a historical sense in our community, in the NGO support community, that we are there to do good. Unfortunately, there are increasing numbers of state actors and para-state actors who simply don't believe that's the case. Next slide, please. The incidents can be a police security agency raid on an office, a home, a work site. It can be very often people picked up on the street. We are increasingly aware that state actors are surveilling NGOs and humanitarian workers. They're following them, they're watching them, they're listening to their phones, they're talking to their contacts, they're getting a sense of their pattern of life. And we've had, in fact, the most recent case I did just this weekend, it was a street detention outside a hotel while an NGO worker was waiting to get in a car to go to a meeting. They were scooped up by the intelligence services and taken away, held over the weekend, classically arrested on a Thursday afternoon, held through Friday, Saturday, Sunday, interrogated, released on the Monday when it was clear that there was nothing actually against them. There won't necessarily, that's badly phrased, that point, there won't necessarily be a notification to your organization. It is not necessary that the police will call your office and say, we've arrested your staff member. The first you may hear about it is when their wife or husband calls at 10 o'clock at night and says, you know, have you seen my partner? They haven't come home yet. You might hear it from a third party. It might be a witness to the abduction or the arrest, detention on the street. One of the first questions is what was the rationale? What was the reason? Be realistic about this. Anybody with content, I'm not sure who the audience is, but on this meeting, but anyone in Kinshasa who has contacts with Rwanda or comes from the Great Lakes region in the east of the country is at risk of being detained by Kinshasa security agencies at the moment. Likewise, anyone in Bukavu and Goma who has had a long-standing relationship with the government in Kinshasa is also likely to get picked up by the other side. One of your earliest questions should be, why have they identified this person? It's unlikely to be random. And know what to do and who to contact. And that comes on to the next slide, please. Your first call will be, the first call that comes probably from your head office, most likely will be triaged by our operations team. We will assess the case very quickly. The duty officer will call you back, most likely will call first to your headquarters and then quickly call on to the fields team where the incidents happened. And very shortly after that, and when I say very shortly after that, I mean within an hour and often within 20 minutes, one of us response consultants will be assigned to the case and will be in touch. We will have an early conversation with you once we've established some ground truths about the incident. We'll have an early conversation with you about whether we should come to you in country or whether we should cover this, work with you remotely. There are advantages both ways, but increasingly we find that, frankly, having someone like me turn up at the field office of an NGO in Eastern DRC or South Sudan or Northern Ethiopia is actually more problematic than helpful. The immediate message to the state authorities, who will have your whole organization under surveillance at this point, will be, why is this international turned up? What's special about this person we've got? And it's more likely to slow it down. We can work very, very effectively as remote support, remote advisors. So don't feel that someone has to come and help. It's okay to do it remotely. We'll also think and advise you on where the CMT and IMT should be located. But the CMT is increasingly likely to also be a remote organization with senior management dispersed around the world in so many organizations now. There's no point in having an effective real CMT in a room somewhere. The IMT, if it probably is going to be in a room in your organization field office. And although we respond immediately and work closely as long as it takes to get, generally as long as it takes to get the detained individual back, there will be an assessment on the basis for evaluating the coverage, which we will need to share with whoever it is who's paying, probably an insurance company. And I say that because there are particular cases of where actually NGO workers have been detained, and it turns out have been working for a resistance organization, a rebel organization. They have actually, we've had cases where they have been spying for opposition governments. And then it gets quite hard to justify our continued support. But we individually, as response consultants and our management, will stay with you as long as we possibly can, even in a situation like that. Next slide. Thanks. It's very important to try and identify the detaining agency, and that can be surprisingly difficult. It may be that the word has gone around that he's been arrested. That I say he because it almost always is male detainees in our experience, who are held for a long period. The women tend to be released quite quickly. That's a generalization, but it's a tendency. The word may go around that the detainee has been arrested by the police, and we find quite quickly that actually it wasn't police, it was an intelligence agency. We need to find out where they're being held. We can learn quite a lot about who is holding them by assessing where the location is. If it's in a local police station, that's going to be relatively straightforward. If it's in intelligence headquarters and they've been flown to the capital, you can pretty much guarantee this is going to take a long time. Are there others in the same situation? Have they scooped up people from half a dozen different agencies at the same time? Is this about putting pressure on NGOs, as Christine was describing earlier? Is this a new administration, a new authority shutting down NGO and humanitarian support? You can always ask for access to the prisoner, and this is one of the reasons why it's important to know who's holding them and where they are. Once you get access to the prisoner, offer to bring them food and blankets and clothing. You probably won't be able to bring them a phone, though we have got phones into police stations in the past. All of these are easy asks, if you see what I mean. It's much easier to say, look, we need to bring him a change of clothes and a blanket and some food, not we need to talk to him to find out why he's been arrested. I call it the need for speed. The quicker you can get involved and engaged, the quicker it's going to be to secure a release. And there's a number of reasons by that, not least because in many developing countries, many more complicated security environments, it's a great deal easier for a policeman or an intelligence operative to arrest someone than it is to get them released. Because to get them released requires authorization and approval up a long, long line of hierarchy and administrative ownership. So the quicker we can get in there, the quicker you can get in there and secure a release, the more likely they are and secure a negotiation, the more quickly they are likely to be released. And it's very important to go high quickly. And that's why if you can maintain a network of contacts in political, military, security agencies, other NGOs, ambassadors, international organizations, work with them as quickly as you can. Eastern DRC cases, again, I mention that because they've been very prevalent in the last year. There are 2 or 3 individuals in M23 in Goma who seem to be able to decide and approve a release quite quickly. I'm not going to mention their names here, but they are M23 officials or officials with the local administration. If you can get to them, you can secure a release quickly. If you don't get to them, it can take a very long time. As often is the case, we don't treat these like a ransom negotiation for someone who's been kidnapped, but there may be reimbursement of costs required, because that often smooths the way. And you may have to deal with the consequences of having done that. And you may have to, we often have conversations with IMTs about whether they should do this because of what it will mean for their operational capability in the future. Next slide, please. Third parties are vital. Christine again mentions the social media issue and the general narrative that goes around very quickly about why this person's been arrested. The families will be probably terrified, frankly, especially in a fast-moving security situation. They'll definitely fear the worst, and they need to be managed very carefully. You need to make sure that you don't lose control of the families, because if you do, then you find that their second, third order negotiations get opened behind your back, and then you lose control of what's going on. Same as with a kidnap. Be open, as open and honest as you can with your staff. Explain what's going on. Explain what you understand is going on. Explain that you are talking at the highest level to secure the release. Try to avoid saying he's innocent, because you don't know what they've been charged with yet. But be sympathetic to their concerns, and be aware that your staff will be thinking, are they next? The bigger international coordination agencies obviously have a role to play. ICRC can often get prison visits when no one else can. And we've asked them for help quite often. Diplomatic pressure can be very effective with these cases. If it's not a local employee, if it's an international staff, getting their ambassador to contact the ministry in the capital can have a pretty quick effect. And as we've discussed earlier, the crisis communications component of this is absolutely essential. Your messaging needs to be very, very carefully calibrated and very clear, and with the minimum scope for confused messaging. Next slide, I think the last one, please. Key points to remember is every case is different. Some of them last 9 months, some of them last 3 days. Some of them, the conditions of detention vary considerably from case to case and from time to time. People will be moved from a relatively benign environment to a very hostile one. There was a chap I helped release a few weeks ago who ended up in a prison cell that was probably had enough space for 10 with 70 people and no food and no light and a bucket in the corner. And he spent a long weekend there and was very unhappy at the end of it. The duration can vary, as I say, from a few hours to many months. Afghanistan cases can run, at the moment, can run into the months, partly because the authorities there, the Taliban, individual Taliban commanders are very nervous about agreeing a release because they don't quite know who they're going to get blamed by for doing that. If it gets to court, it can extend considerably. Of course, if the court finds the person guilty and sends them to prison, then you're into a whole new crisis. A good lawyer is essential in that situation. And one of the people that you should keep on your contacts list is a good lawyer who understands that one of the things you may ask them to do is to try and secure the release or defend one of your staff in a court case against them. The best solution, use your influence and network as quickly as possible. Go high, go fast. Deal with the consequences of whatever you have to do to secure the release as soon as you have the release. Try not to let your long-term concerns about the viability of your operation limit your choices in this moment, because the consequences can be quite critically damaging. And trust the advice that you get. I say that obviously as the advisor. We have done many of these. Everybody in my bit of the world has worked on multiple cases in multiple jurisdictions. We have systems that work, and the advice that we give is generally reliable. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Rob. So great. I've seen some questions be added to the chat, so that's great. Feel free to continue to add them, or you can raise your hand. So first off, I've got two questions kind of related to data that I'll pose to you, Abby, first, but then Rob, if you want to add on to that, just because it's related to some topics you mentioned. Two participants were interested in Abby, if the data says anything about the gender of those who are detained, and then whether or not the length of detentions is being tracked, and whether there's any trends there.
Sure, good questions. In terms of the gender split, incident reports don't always include the gender of staff affected, believe it or not. But of the ones that we have where the gender is known, it's around 160 men and 24 women of incidents sort of going back. So that's a ratio of 7-to-1 in absolute numbers, but we don't have the rates to say if either men or women are more affected than the other relative to their numbers in the locations and positions where the detentions occurred. We do have a general denominator of humanitarian workforce numbers.
No, we lost Abby for a second.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yep, good.
Sorry. I was saying that we do have a general denominator for staff, but because organizations don't publish and probably don't know the gender ratio of their staffs, we can't do specific rates yet. But in terms of nationalities, as I said, overwhelmingly they are nationals of the country where it happened. In terms of the internationals that were detained, we haven't really done an analysis of the breakdown of nationalities, and we may well do this, but I think that is less important in terms of who is being targeted than the organizations that they're working for. And in the data, we see 3 organizations that have been targeted the most. 2 are UN agencies and 1 is ICRC, but our confidentiality rules won't allow me to get any more specific than that.
Great, thanks, Abby. And then anything on the length of detentions?
Yeah. So this is going to be something that we look at. Years ago, when we did an in-depth study on kidnappings, we noticed that international staff had longer durations of being held vis-a-vis national staff, where often, and really in 80% of incidents, the victims were released within a few days after some kind of intervention by community members, et cetera, or some kind of negotiation. So that will be something that we do in advance of our aid worker security report, which we produce annually, and this year, which will focus on detentions.
Great, thanks, Abby. Rob, is there anything you wanted to add on those 2 topics of gender and length of detention? I know you mentioned them briefly, but anything additional? Oh, so you're on mute. Oh, can you unmute yourself? Sorry.
Sorry, I dropped out for a couple of minutes and it's only just come back on again. Um, I would say I heard most of what Abby's points. Absolutely agree. The ratio sounds about, interestingly, almost exactly what I'd say ours was. Um, what we do see is that often a group are detained and the women are released quickly. Now, you may be registering absolute detention numbers. I would I I I would say empirically that really the overwhelming majority of detainees who are held for more than 24 hours, 48 hours are male. So there is something, some judgment being made, some cultural something going on there. Duration, as I said, hours to months.
Maybe just to chime in that when we count something as a detention or a kidnapping in the aid worker security database, the criterion is they have to be held for 24 hours or more.
Ah, interesting. Okay. Okay.
Great. Okay, Christina, I've got a question for you in the chat. What have you found to be the triggers slash tipping points when negative sentiment goes over to negative actions against aid workers or aid organizations?
Thanks for this really, really useful question. I think, as Rob said, every case is unique, so it's quite hard to come up with a general rule, but I will try it anyway. I think what sort of triggers this is first an underlying motive within the state forces um, to be upset about aid agencies in some form of whatever reason that is, or to see it as a useful tool to promote some other policy. So, but what would trigger it that this would actually turn into a direct arrest? I think there usually is some sort of act that is interpreted as a provocation. And the provocation can be as something as simple as collecting data for needs assessment or for security assessments. And that's then defined as espionage. And that may be strategically used, or it may actually be genuinely thought that there was something suspicious, malicious going on by the aid agency to collect data. So that can be a trigger point. Another trigger point that I think that we've seen a few times is when aid agencies appear as arrogant by perhaps referring very standardly to basic principles of who can or cannot have aid, or how certain things should be distributed or not distributed or something like that, in a context where there are state forces that have a very strong anti-colonial agenda, for example. And then some sort of very principally delivered, this is how we do it, approach can be seen as a very strong provocation that then may trigger actions that, from the sort of sense now we show it to them, which could be we withdraw their license, we search their offices, we arrest people who don't behave as we think they should be behaving in our country. So these are sort of a few incidents where we've really seen that specific activities not meant in the way they were interpreted, but that triggered specific arrests. I think in other cases, it can be also much more strategic and even internationally related. And I think that would apply to the few cases of international aid workers where their nationality may matter. This could be, for example, when there are sanction regimes and when a certain government wants to have some sort of pressure on a government to do certain things or not to do certain things. And some governments have found it a tactic to arrest foreign aid workers and use that as a bargaining chip within some issue that had absolutely nothing to do with aid. So that can also happen. So it's very wide ranging. So it's very hard to say this is always how it happens. So I think it's important to be very sensitive to the atmospheres, the conversations going on in the country, and to adjusting the communication to those who are in power, but in ways that you don't forego your principles, and that it's not a question of being too close to power, because that will come to harm you the moment power changes again.
Thanks, Christina. So I have a quite a large question and then a related one about advocacy that I'll just pose, and whichever three of you feel interested to answer, let me know. So in a context such as Israel and occupied Palestinian territories, where disinformation and misinformation on humanitarian actors is especially high from the state and especially high against humanitarian actors, would you advise to go public anyway, even if it means that humanitarian actors might not be able to operate? How do we find a balance? And then also related, suggestions on how context can be developed while still mitigating any possible negative narratives. So, organization outreach, advocacy. How do you find that balance? That's a hard question.
Sounds like one for Abby, actually.
Abby, you've been chosen. Do you have anything to say about advocacy and finding the balance?
Advocacy in general, we have found works best when it is behind the scenes and supported by a political actor with some leverage. I don't have a lot of hope for kind of public advocacy by NGOs in this, but I really think it is an issue for international humanitarian diplomacy, to the extent that that is something that member states are now beginning to engage with, what I think is kind of a hopeful sign. So that's kind of where I would be looking, but let me know if I misunderstood the question.
Great, thanks, Abby. We just have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to pose the last question to Rob. Where the reason for the detention or arrest would be considered a criminal offense in the home country of the individual, how does this affect insurance coverage or support by the response provider?
Yeah, good question. Exactly that, it affects it quite severely. It means that you're unlikely to be covered. If the arrested detained individual has committed a crime that would be considered a crime in their home country, then we would probably have to withdraw. And that's just the way it is. There are circumstances where we'd continue to support. And I'm trying to think of there was a case where an NGO driver knocked down and killed a child. He'd been drinking. And I'm not going to say where it was, but we stayed on the case for quite a long time to at least get to the point where the local organization had secured a legal support for him and was, moving into the next stage. But generally, that would terminate our support.
Thanks, Rob. So thanks again to the presenters. I'm just going to take the last minute here to plug a couple upcoming products. As Abby mentioned, our annual aid worker security report, which will be released on World Humanitarian Day, will be on the focus of detentions this year. So if you would like to be interviewed on this topic, you have something specific to share on detentions, either personally or from your organization or your expertise, please feel free to either contact us or put your email in the chat right now, and we will reach out to you. Another thing that I feel like most people on this call have already heard of, but the Good Practice Review, GPR8, Humanitarian Security Risk Management, we worked over the last 4 years to update this, and it is now available, the full PDF text in English, French, and Spanish from the HPN website. The links are in the chat. And also, we are excited to share that the dedicated microsite that allows you to interact with summaries of the chapters and figures is available in those 3 languages, but also Arabic now. So we hope that you might share these with your non-English speaking networks, and it would hopefully be a resource that some might find useful in the community. So thanks again for everybody that joined. And I see some people are putting their email in the chat right now, so that's great. That's all we had for today. So thanks very much for joining, and a recording of this will be posted online afterwards. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.